Hello, my name is Emily Depew, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you are interested. After the presentation, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming a professor at the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Dr. Jonathan Abel.
Afternoon, everybody. Dr. Sean Faulkner is the William A. Stofft Professor of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He served 23 years in the U.S. Army and commanded a tank company in the 1st Armored Division during Operation Desert Storm. He is the award-winning author of The School of Hard Knocks, Combat Leadership in the American Expeditionary Forces, and the relatively recently released Pershing's Crusaders, the American Soldier in World War I. His talk today is called the Aisne-Marne Campaign, the turning point of the Great War in the West. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Faulkner.
Well, good afternoon. Everybody hear me well? Yeah, I've got a voice and a face for radio, so if that goes out, I can probably help out here. It is, as always, a joy to come and speak at the Dole Center. We always have very good audiences. So hopefully dragging you out on this very nice early spring afternoon, I'll give you something to think about. Now, if you've been to one of our recent programs, this year's theme from the Department of Military History at Leavenworth are turning points of conflicts. Now, this is a fascinating topic, and all the military historians just love to play with this stuff, but we got to realize that usually the turning points of war are something a bunch of historians sit around and figure out years after the conflict is over. To me, I sort of like the Watergate approach. What did they know and when did they know it? So what point in time did the combatants themselves understand that they had reached a turning point in the war? Now, in some cases, in some of the conflicts we've already talked about in the program and some to come, the turning points are quite obvious. On the afternoon of the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, Napoleon was damn certain that after crushing the Prussian army, he had reached a turning point. It's a lot harder to figure out, though, when you're dealing with long, ugly, attritional total wars. Because these turning points are not necessarily decided by a battle or a series of battles. They're generally decided by tangibles and intangibles. The point in time where a society has reached a tipping point, that it no longer has the manpower and the resources, and most importantly, the will to continue the battle. Now, in the years leading up to World War I, there's already concerns about this in some of the capitals of Europe. Hans Delbrück, the great German military historian, had warned the German General Staff, told them something in 1905 that they didn't want to hear. The German General Staff was planning for a quick, decisive victory. Delbrück warned them, you know, if you're not careful, the next war is going to be a long, ugly war. And in these types of conflicts, the winner's going to be the who can maintain the last dollar in their pocket and the last 500,000 men in the field. Now, he's talking about material things, manpower, money. But Georges Clemenceau, who will play an important role in today's presentation, the premier, the Prime Minister of France, also gets at that other aspect. The tipping points in attritional total wars are often won in the minds of the people, in the minds of the political and military leaders. So victory can come to that who can believe for just that half an hour more than the enemy that victory is possible. Now, what's interesting about World War I, and probably puts it a little aside from some of the other presentations you'll hear about turning points during our program, is it's not at all evident to the major combatants on either side until very late in the conflict that the tide had turned. If you think about the American Civil War, while Lincoln had his doubts about his re-election possibilities in 1864, by the end of the summer of 1864, Sherman and Grant surely understood that the Confederates were in precipitous decline. And I would argue by the time you get to the end of 1943, the Allies have irreversible momentum in both Pacific and Europe. In World War I, it's not at all clear that this war has reached its turning point to the last 4 months of the conflict. So, we're going to have to go back a little bit further. The reason for this is the disastrous year that the Allies have in 1917. In fact, George Clemenceau says this is the year of our troubles. And what you start to see is an almost unbroken line of disappointments and defeat in the Allied ranks. Year started with some promise. General Nivelle, the new commander of the French army, had promised the French people, had promised the French government that he had a plan for victory. He had figured out in the waning days of Verdun how to finally beat the Germans. So he launches his war-winning campaign in April of 1917. Germans, though, had used a new doctrine, and the French went forward into a massacre. And after weeks and weeks of futile attempts to break the German lines, at least 54 of the divisions in the French army went into what the French like to call collective indiscipline, what we like to call mutiny. Now, in the wake of this, things are not going to get better on the Western Front. Beginning in July, the British will launch another disastrous offensive in Ypres in Belgium. And after months and months and months, slogging through the mud, losing tens of thousands of casualties, the offensive will ultimately slide to an end in November, falling well short of its goal of breaking through the German lines. Now, if that's bad enough on the Western fronts, things are also not going well for the Allies on the Southern front. In October of 1917, the Germans and the Austrians combined to launch a massive attack on the Italian army at Caporetto. In about a week and a half of constant fighting, they managed to push the Italians almost back to where their army had started their offensives, the first ascenso, in 1915. More ominously, by the time the enemy offensive had come to an end, over 260,000 Italian prisoners were in POW camps. While that's all bad, the real disaster for the Allies comes in the East. In March of 1917, the Tsar abdicates, beginning the Russian Revolution. And the Russians, under Kerensky, form a provisional government and hoping of bringing order to this now Tsarless Russia. The problem is, he is going to live up to his promises to the Allies to keep Russia into the war. And so in July of 1917, he orders his best generals to launch an offensive to try to break through the German lines, living up to their promises. After 2 weeks of futile fighting, it also grinds to a halt, and the last reservoirs of morale of the Russian army are sapped away. In the midst of this incompetence, finally in October of 1917, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin begins the Bolshevik Revolution, ousts the provisional government, takes control of the elements of the government power and military power in Petrograd. So across the board, this is a pretty ugly year for the Allies. In fact, at the beginning of 1918, the most optimistic view of the war comes from John J. Pershing, a guy who hasn't really been on the ground very long. He is alone in believing that maybe, just maybe, the Allies can win the war in 1919. British commanders such as Robertson and even Winston Churchill have a more glum assessment. They think at best the Allies maybe, possibly, can end the war in 1920. So nobody is looking forward to an Allied victory. What's compounded here is the Bolsheviks. When Lenin comes to power, he promises the Russian people peace, land, bread. The problem is he doesn't have any of that. He needs to consolidate his hold on power in Russia, but to do so, the first and most important thing he must do is bring peace, to end the war between Russia and the Germans. So he sends his envoy, Leon Trotsky, to treat with the Germans at Brest-Litovsk. Now the good news is the Germans are more than happy to give them peace. But it's going to be peace for peace. We'll give you peace on the Eastern Front for a piece of Poland, a piece of the Ukraine, and a piece of the Baltics. And after the Bolsheviks balk at this, the Germans drive on with a major offensive that ultimately convinces the Russians, the Bolsheviks, to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This seems to be a major strategic turning point in the war. First of all, the Germans occupy what is essentially the breadbasket of Russia. Now, what's going on in Germany at this time is they have starvation going in all the major cities. The Allied naval blockade is severely restricting the flow of food inside. In fact, the average denizen in Berlin, by the time you get to the middle of 1917, is subsisting on about 1,600 calories a day. Okay, on your way home, get a Big Mac Happy Meal, okay? Not a supersize. And that's what the average German is subsisting on in the middle of the war. When they occupy this territory, in theory, they're going to solve that problem. Now, who's ever heard of the term Lebensraum? Living space. Now, we associate that with the Nazis. Actually, it's the Imperial Germans that come up with this idea of a kleptocracy. Go in and take everything you can. The problem is, thank goodness, the Germans can always be relied on to make strategic mistakes, is once you start to expropriate all of this stuff from the countryside, it torques off the locals just a mite bit. And so while it is going to solve some of Germany's problems, it's going to create others. The biggest strategic thing that it's going to do for the Germans is now free up manpower. Since 1914, the Germans have been stuck in a two-front war that has siphoned away a lot of their resources. With Russia out of the war, in theory, the Germans can now take large numbers of their soldiers, move them to the west to fight the British and the French and the Americans. But again, you start taking livestock from the locals, they're going to get pissed off. And so in the end, the Germans have to leave nearly 1 million men on the Eastern Front just to hold on to their ill-gotten gains. They're still able, though, to send 38 divisions to the Western Front. The other thing this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk does, though, is solidifies the resilience of the West. And by the time you get to December of 1918, all of the major European powers, the French, the British, and the Germans, are now run by hardliners. In the case of the Western Allies, David Lloyd George is now the Prime Minister of Britain, and Georges Clemenceau is the Prime Minister of France. And as shortages and sacrifices are starting to compile in this total attritional war, Clemenceau and Lloyd George can turn to their people and go, we've got to fight this to an end. Just look at what the Russians or the Germans did to the Russians. If we bow, you can expect that level of Carthaginian peace. Now, Clemenceau's nickname is La Tigre, the tiger. And as you can sort of see, this is one of my favorite quotes from Clemenceau. Pretty obvious why that is. My home policy, I make war. My foreign policy, I make war. I make war. All the time, I wage war. Okay? In case we're lost on the subtlety here, Clemenceau makes war. So as the situation starts to get a little sketchy on the Western Front in 1918, the political leaders are going to give the military leaders the support they need to bring this war to conclusion. And they're going to need all the help they can get. By 1918, all of the major powers, with the exception of the Americans, are reaching the bottom of their manpower barrel. These are just some indicators of what some of the new soldiers in 1918 look like. Shortages of personnel, for example, in the British Army means that in January of 1918, they reduced their infantry divisions from 12 battalions to 9 battalions. The War Cabinet says on their best projections that they're going to need over 600,000 fresh recruits just to replace the wastage that they expect to have in 1918. Problem is their manpower estimates say at best they can bring in 100,000 conscripts. The good news, though, are these guys. In April of 1918, German unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram brings the United States into the conflict. This is going to alleviate some of the tensions that the Allies have in manpower. But in 1918, this is still a promise and a hope rather than a reality. When we entered the war in April of 1917, our National Guard and Regular Army is just around 300,000 men. And to fight this war, to actually play a part and make a role, an important role in the outcome, the War Department estimates it's going to need 4 million. We actually managed to pull that off. By the time of the armistice in November of 1918, over 2 million of these American soldiers make it overseas. The problem is, they're horribly trained. While the Europeans were basically learning the realities of modern war from 1914 to 1917, the U.S. Army was chasing banditos in Mexico and serving as imperial constabulary forces around the world. It's going to be a long, hard slog for the doughboys to figure out the realities of modern war. And the Allies are aware of this. So we've got the promise, but the reality's not there yet. Now, with the disaster in Russia and the disaster at Caporetto, the Allies realize that the shoe is about to fall. They know it's only a matter of time before the Germans take all those troops they had on the Eastern Front and move them to hit them on the Western Front. And in a moment of crisis, they start to make structural changes to their organization that, frankly, they should have been doing as early as 1914. So all the Allied political and military leaders meet in Rapallo, Italy. And after a lot of wrangling, the one thing they could agree on is the establishment of this, the Supreme Allied War Council. Now, the Supreme Allied War Council was intended to better coordinate the entirety of the Allied war effort. It's got both military representatives and political representatives from all of the major powers. They're given the power to control important and limited resources, such as shipping, which is important to get the Americans over, and also who gets what call on what raw materials to fight this total war. What needs to happen that they refuse to do is to take the next step, which is to take and appoint a single commander as the director of the entire Allied war effort militarily. Now, this happens for a couple of reasons. While Lloyd George is actually in favor of having a Supreme Allied War Commander, he recognizes that this will naturally be a Frenchman. The French have the majority of the forces on the front. It's only logical that they're going to be the guy who leads it. Now, he's okay with that. He hates Douglas Haig's guts and would like to see him replaced. Unfortunately, Douglas Haig has a lot of political overhead, a lot of capital on his side, and the British Prime Minister is not at all assured that the British people in his own war cabinet would support such a move. Ironically, Clemenceau mildly supports the possibility of having a supreme French war commander, but at Rapallo, he's afraid that such a leader would actually siphon away his political power. So he is unwilling to take the next step. Unfortunately, the little bit of changes that come out at this place in time are too little too late. The Germans recognize that time is no longer on their side, that they have a narrow window of opportunity to win the war before large numbers of Americans can come in and fundamentally change the ground realities. For the first time in the war, with the new reinforcements that come from the east, the Germans have a superiority over the Allied armies in the west. They managed to mass over 4 million men. The question is what to do with them. The one who's actually running the war effort, you have the two great warlords, Paul von Hindenburg on the left Erich Ludendorff on the right, with Ludendorff really taking the lead in the war planning. Ludendorff is going to come up with the war plan to win the war for Germany. He's going to start off with what's known as Operation Michael and the old Somme battlefield. If he hits there, it comes at the junction between the British and the French armies. And he hopes by hitting them, it will split the Allies. He knows at this critical junction, if he's hit hard enough, the French will pull back to support and protect Paris, and the British will move to the north to protect their logistics bases and their channel ports. What he's really hoping that in the midst of this confusion, if he can hit them hard enough here, it will force the Allies to take their little, small number of reserves and commit them to this sector. And once that's done, the second shoe will fall. The idea is really not to break the lines here, but to attack the British in Flanders. If he attacks in what will become known as Operation Georgette, the idea is push behind the British Army, cut their logistics lines to their field forces, threaten their channel ports, push the British Army, separated now from the French, up against the channel, where they'll either be destroyed or they'll get on transports and go home. The goal is not necessarily to win the war militarily, but to force a separate peace on either France or Britain. When the attack falls, Michael, on the 21st of March, 1918, it's a resounding success. The British are caught by surprise, even though they've been expecting this for months. And in over 2 weeks, they pushed the British all the way back to where the British had started their offensive on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, basically crushing the British Fifth Army. This is the crisis point, the biggest crisis point for the Allied ranks since the Battle of the Marne in 1914. And only in the midst of this crisis do they finally take that last step. Clemenceau and Lloyd George both agree now is the time to establish a Generalissimo, a supreme Allied war commander. The question, of course, is who's it going to be? They know it's going to be a Frenchman. Going into the conference at Doullens, Clemenceau is betting on Henri Philippe Pétain. Pétain is the greatest general the French create during the war. He has already saved France twice, once at Verdun and once in the aftermath of the French mutinies. He is a much better general than any of the other candidates. The problem is Pétain is naturally pessimistic. And in the face of this disaster caused by the German offensives, he voices his concerns about the ability of the Allies to win. When Ferdinand Foch arrives, there's a different estimation. The first thing he does is pounds his fist on the table and tells everyone around the table that I would fight in front of Amiens, I would fight in Amiens, I'd fight behind Amiens, I would fight all the time. Sound familiar? This is a guy after Clemenceau's heart. So Foch is going to be the man, and he's actually a very good choice. Prior to the war, he had been the director of the French equivalent of the Army War College. So he had already written books on tactics, even though some of them were quite wrong, as we found out in 1914. But as the director of the War College, he had already made contact with a number of the British officers that he would later serve with in World War I. More importantly, in the late months of 1914, early 1915, he was the commander of Army Group North, which was French, British, and Belgian forces up in the north of Belgium and France. So he already has experience sort of cajoling and working a bunch of different groups together. So now that you've got the man, the problem is, what are his powers going to be? Under the Doullens Conference, Foch now has the ability to command Allied armies, to direct the strategic military interactions of all forces in France. Sounds good. Except there's a caveat. To get everybody to agree to it, the Beauvais Conference also says, at any point in time, any of the national army commanders disagree with what Foch is asking of them, they can appeal to their national political leaders for adjudication. Fortunately for Foch, his personality is going to prevent a lot of this as the battle goes on. The person who gives him the hardest time is the American John J. Pershing. Now, part of this is just the nature of the American participation in the war. The United States is not part of the Allies. It is an associated power. And that reflects Woodrow Wilson's overarching desire for the American participation in the war. To Wilson, the defeat of Imperial Germany is only the stepping stone to really remaking Europe in the world. Now, those are some pretty tall orders. And he knows that the important thing is going to be decided at the peace conference that follows the victory. But if the United States is going to have a seat at the table, a meaningful seat at the table, then the Americans have to make a sacrifice. They have to bleed their way to the conference table. And the only way to do that is as an entire united American army with its own sector of the front. And Pershing and Foch spark over this from the very beginning. From the minute that the Americans arrive in Europe, the British and the French want to grab American soldiers and put them in existing Allied formations. Call it amalgamation. Now, that not only goes against what Wilson had told Pershing to do, but it also, sort of goes against Pershing's own professional desires. And in the midst of this crisis, Foch and Pershing go back and forth about the employment of American forces. And ultimately, Pershing insists that he'll gladly give up American units, but they have to fight as American divisions under American command as part of larger French formations. While they're going back and forth, though, the Germans are still moving forward. While Michael was successful, ultimately it runs out of steam. Georgette, that will follow, will make initial headways, but will also quickly die. Now, if you're Ludendorff, you've got a problem. The clock is still ticking. You still have to retain the advantage, the initiative in the battle. At any point in time you stop, all the advantages that the Allies have will start to build, and your disadvantages will start to multiply. To retain that initiative, he launches his third great push, Operation Blucher. With innovative artillery tactics and the stormtrooper tactics that had already been proven in the previous two offensives, German troops go bubbling across the old Schmidendam battlefield, site of Nivelle's defeat in 1917. They hit the French Sixth Army under Duchesne. Now, Duchesne had not listened to Pétain, who had warned him of the potential of a German attack. And the French are caught by surprise. And in 7 days, his army is nearly crushed, and it's forced to retreat over 56 miles. More importantly, they lose the key railhead at Soissons, and the railhead at Chateau Thierry is under German artillery fire. Things are looking bad for the home team. In the midst of this, Pershing is true to his commitments. Any Marines here? Yeah, I wouldn't admit it either. It's okay. You need to put fresh troops in to hold the advance. And so Pershing offers up the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd Division. And they're going to be used to plug some of the holes. One of the holes that is plugged is here just to the west of Chateau Thierry. And the American 2nd Division, which is a unique formation. One of its brigades are regular Army troops. The other brigades are U.S. Marines. They'll be thrown in at this time to stop the continuation of the German penetration. After 4 days of constant attacks by the Germans, Jean Georgette, the corps commander, says it's time to go on the offensive. And for the next 20 days, the Americans will bash against the German defenses, creating one of the great legends, or some of the great legends of World War I. Okay? To the point that if you were to ask an average American in 1917, tell me about the Marine Corps, they'd look at you strange. It's a tiny organization of 13,000 guys. And the Marines can talk about Tun Tavern, and they can talk about the shores of Tripoli and the halls of Montezuma, but the true birth of the United States Marine Corps is here at Belleau Woods. While they're doing that, the Germans have their own problems. Funny thing about a salient. A salient, by definition, is pushed deep into enemy territory. When you are deep into enemy territory, by definition, the enemy is deep in your territory. This success, the Germans have been victims of their own catastrophic success. The Crown Prince, which is the Kaiser's son, is the operational commander here. Yeah, he's gained a lot of ground, but it's not necessarily been the right ground. All the little green dotted lines there are the key rail networks, and 1918 is all about getting the right rail networks. And while the Germans are successful at cutting the major rail link that links Paris to Chalons and then on to the eastern portion of the Western Front, when the Germans take the salient, they're not able to use all of the other railroads to supply their own troops. As long as the French hold Rennes, they hold Chalons, having Soissons is not really going to help them out. So the Germans understand that they have their own dilemma. The problem now with Ludendorff is he is schizophrenic. I want to attack here. Well, that didn't work. Well, I'm going to attack here. Well, that didn't work. Ultimately, he still wants to push the British in Flanders. But since he's had success here, that's where he commits his next forces. Operation Mannschutz-Rennes. The idea here is to actually open up some of the logistics bottlenecks that the German soldiers in the Marne salient are experiencing. If he can push in and take Rennes and then push on to Chalons, now the Germans have unimpeded railroad networks that can keep the troops in the pocket supplied. He further hopes that success here would again draw Allied reserves so he can fight in Flanders. Foch, though, can read a map as well as the Germans can. He understands quite well the problems that the Germans have created for themselves in the Marne salient. Quietly, he starts to reinforce the shoulders, anticipating that the next great blow will fall around Reims. He also starts to direct his intelligence gathering capability to finding the one thing he absolutely needs to know. He knows it's going to happen, he just doesn't know when. Through a series of trench raids, through capturing prisoners, and ultimately capturing a German officer who has the German plan in his map case, Foch understands exactly what the Germans are going to do. He understands that shortly after midnight on the 15th of July, the Germans will begin their preparatory hurricane bombardment, followed by the infantry attack. By having that information directly at midnight, Foch's own artillery opens up all along where the German concentration areas are going to be, killing hundreds of Germans, but more importantly, completely disrupting the attack that's going to happen shortly after midnight. The German barrage goes off as planned, but since the German infantry are confused, they lose a lot of the benefits that would have been gained from the bombardment. Also, by knowing what the Germans are going to do, Foch is able to pull most of his troops back from the front lines. They're going to be bombarded, leaving only a thin veneer of troops, so the German bombardments basically falls on nothing. As the Chancellor of Germany will say, the history of the world played out in 3 days. This will be the last great German offensive of the war. And the guy who knows it before anybody else is Ferdinand Foch. Foch realizes, in fact, since the 10th of June, in the midst of all of the disasters, as early as the 10th of June, Foch is already looking for an opportunity to strike back at the Germans, to regain the initiative, having lost it since the end of March 1918. To him, the perfect place to hit is now the salient. You can hit the Germans from 4 sides. He turns to Pétain, who is the commander of French forces, directs the offensive, and Pétain turns it on to Émile Foyel to carry on the operation. Foch and Pétain dedicate 4 entire French armies to reducing the salient. But even then, it's not going to be enough manpower. Foch needs more troops. First thing he does is he goes to Douglas Haig, the commander of the British Army. Hey, Doug, I need a help. Give me a corps and 2 divisions. Now, Haig has had his face kicked in since March of 1918. He rightly fears that the Germans are only waiting to launch another attack against him in Flanders, and so he is hesitant to commit troops. Fortunately, Foch and him had fought together at the Somme in 1916. And when David Lloyd George were pressing Foch to give a bad report on Haig so Lloyd George could replace him, Foch had stuck by the British. And even though at this point in time, Haig really wanted to invoke that Beauvais Agreement and take his concerns to Lloyd George, he demurs and sends Foch what he wants. The Italians will also have 2 divisions in this operation. And the backside of their defeat at Caporetto, as an assurance to the Western Allies that they're serious about the war, they send a handful of troops to the Western Front. Lastly, Pershing promises 8 American divisions. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but each American division is twice the size of the comparable French, German, or British divisions. So what Foch now has here is a multilingual, multinational coalition. Duchesne's plan is to make the main effort here with Charles Mangean. Now, Mangean's an interesting character. He was one of the guys involved in that disaster at the Nivelle Offensive. Mangean, the French soldiers will have a take on this. Mangean is like manger, to eat. So they call him the eater of men. But the good thing about him is he's highly aggressive. He'll be the main effort. The idea is he will push in, and for this great French victory, I'll have to use a great French pointer. He will push here the north, just south of Soissons. And the idea is he is drawing the rope around the neck of the salient. If he can move fast enough, he will catch the Germans in the pocket, where they'll be cut off and ultimately killed or captured. While he's attacking here, the Ninth Army in the south will hold the bottom of the bag by attacking, removing the bridgehead that the Germans have established on the Marne. He will hold on to the German forces to keep them from rapidly leaving the area. While this is going on, the Sixth Army will support Mangean by pushing in to, again, like Mangean, try to cut the German main supply route. You'll notice the thing in the middle that draws all the German supply lines together is this little key town, Varennes-Tardenois. As they're pushing forward here, the idea is to cut all the roads going into there. Lastly, the Fifth Army will attack here in the east. Their whole idea is to attack to make sure the Germans are not able to take reinforcements from here and move them against the main effort. When the attack begins, it works beautifully. Viola set up a set-piece battle. The French have learned how to fight modern war by this time. They've massed a number of tanks, they've massed aircraft, they've massed artillery. They take a page out of the Germans' book. The offensive starts with a massive hurricane bombardment that stuns the German defenders. I like that quote from Lieutenant Sulzbach. That's sort of giving you the indicator of what it's like for the Germans to be in this offensive. After completely beating on the Allies since the end of March, it's incredulous to the Germans that the Allies can now turn back and punch them in the mouth. With the element of surprise, Mangean manages to surge across. And in the first day of the battle, he captures over 20,000 German prisoners, 800 cannons and mortars, and over 3,000 machine guns. Things are looking pretty good. The next day, he will continue the attack. But he's not getting quite as far in as he had done the day before. And finally, by the third day of the battle, Mangean is grinding to a halt. Unfortunately, this is the reality of battle in World War I. While having the element of surprise in the first 2 days of the battle was good, by the third day, the Germans know what you're doing. The Germans are master of defensive tactics. The Crown Prince allows the Germans to pull back to better defensive terrain on the Tardenois Plateau. along the rivers, solidifies his hold, but also the nature of offensive operations in World War I is just grinding it down. These troops have been fighting in trenches and they've been fighting on the defense basically since 1914. And so to now be thrown out in the open against enemies that still have a lot of defensive firepower is going to create some massive command and control issues. And it doesn't help that, again, you've got English, you've got Americans, you've got French, all participating together in this campaign. In addition, they're just having a very hard time supplying the troops. The road network has been heavily bombed. It's cratered. It's hard to get stuff through. But most importantly, like most offensives in World War I, the biggest challenge is bringing up the artillery. They can fire and support, but at some point in time, the infantry are going to move so far forward that the artillery has to move forward. And in that lull, the enemy can easily counterattack. At this point in time, Pétain goes to Foch and says, we've accomplished all we can do here. If we continue on the attack, all we're going to do is have more and more casualties for less and less return. Foch basically kicks him out of the office. No, this is the right point in time to end this. We have the initiative. It's going to be costly, but we got to press forward. Fortunately for Foch, this attitude is also supported by Fayolle on the ground. But it's going to take some time to get the offensive going. The 10th Army is shot, and it's going to take a couple of days to get them reinforcements and replacements to get them back up to strength. In the meantime, the main effort of the French attack will now shift to the 6th Army, along with a number of American divisions. The 10th Army will do local attacks as best they can to keep the Germans pinned down, but the main effort is now to move forward across the Tardenois plateau to take Fère and Tardenois. The 9th Army will continue to hold the south. The 5th Army will continue to keep reinforcements, the Germans from sending reinforcements across the salient. It's ugly, it's brutal, but by the 6th of August, Soissons has been liberated. The Germans have been pushed back nearly to their start point at the beginning of Operation Blücher, and the rail lines that now connect Paris through Chalons onto the east are open. That's going to be important for the Americans because ultimately those rail lines will supply the AEF. Speaking of the AEF, this is truly the first great American battle. While there were American divisions at Château-Thierry and American divisions at Belleau Woods and Vaux, this is the first time where large numbers of Americans are committed to the battle. Now, in the beginning, though, the French are not at all assured that the Americans have the know-how to really fight modern war. You sort of see it in the deployment here. Between the 1st and 2nd Division, for example, there's a French division in between. The Americans are sandwiched in, so they can't do too many dumb things. The 4th Division is even split with one brigade to the north and one brigade to the south of a French division. Fortunately, though, the French commander of the 6th Army allows the American 1st Corps under Hunter Liggett to enter the line as a complete entity. And this is going to be the first time that large forces of the American Army go into battle. The Americans are doing so well that finally Foch agrees to give Pershing what he's long wanted, the creation of an independent American army with its own sector of the front. And just to show that the Americans now have the full faith and confidence of the Allied High Command, finally on the 4th of August, the other American Corps, the 3rd Corps, is committed to the battle. And they will end the Battle of Soissons, the Second Battle of the Marne, fighting side by side all the way to the Aisne River. So, this is the end result. Sometimes you got to break some eggs to win some wars. Foch himself will say it takes 15,000 casualties to train a major general. And that sounds harsh, but under the realities of World War I, sadly, it's probably true. But what you should notice here is the disparity between the casualties by the Allies and the casualties of the Germans. Traditionally, we expect the defender to kill or injure a lot more of the attacker than the other way around. The Allies finally figuring out how to fight open warfare, with all of the advantages they have in industrial production, inflict more damage on the Germans than they themselves take, even though they're attacking. More importantly, the Allies captured nearly 30,000 German prisoners of war. You start taking that many prisoners, you start to believe that something's wrong with the morale of the other side. More importantly, the condition of these prisoners is letting the French High Command know that maybe the Germans are getting ready to crack. They're malnourished. A number of them have this nasty thing called the Spanish flu. And so maybe, just maybe, it's time to change the reality of the war. In the middle of the campaign, it's interesting that down at the lowest level, the soldiers themselves are starting to believe that things have changed. I love this letter from this Marine. Okay? First of all, don't you think the last piece of work of action was a wonderful piece of strategy by General Foch? I mean, when's the last time you heard an American soldier talk nice about a general? I'm just saying. I know I don't. I just don't. Okay? But then what's interesting is what he goes on to say. Hey, folks back home, start listening, watching, reading the paper, because things are changing. We can feel it. And then he adds that last thing. Sometimes I think it will all end this fall. Boy, this is a long way away from the war going on until 1920. And the person who would agree with our good Marine Corps private is Foch himself. While the Battle of Soissons is raging, he greets together all of his commanders and says, okay, the indications from this battle is the Germans are done. They have reached the high point of their offensive capability, and now it's time for us to regain the strategic initiative in the war. And he lists out now what it's going to take. And it's interesting, at this point, the 24th of July, 1918, Foch himself is still thinking that the war will end in 1919. That by 1919, the Americans will be in, they'll be trained. So when he's telling all his subordinate commanders, his vision for 1918 is to continue to push the Germans out of as much occupied France and Belgium as possible, capture key railroad nodes to basically set the condition for an Allied success in 1919. But he's not done. Even before putting out this memorandum, he turns to Douglas Haig and says, Haig, we are hitting the Germans hard at Soissons. I need you to start hitting them hard at the Somme. Now again, Haig's number one concern are his defensives in Flanders, so he's demurring on this. But Foch knows how to cajole, and he knows how to bribe. He says, okay, I tell you what, Doug, I got a deal for you. Not only will I return all of the British units that you've committed to the Battle of the Marne, I'll give you the French First Army for the offensive. The next foot will fall on the 8th of August, 1918. This will be one of the first great combined arms battles. The British have planned this as a beautiful set piece. You've got aviation, you've got tanks, you've got infantry, you've got artillery, all working well together. The aviation going deep to interdict the Germans coming into the area. Artillery already pre-registered on the key targets in the German line. And when this goes forward, it's like a tide. And that tide continues on for several more days. And by the time you get to just 4 days into the offensive, they've already pushed the Germans out of the salient they created by the Michael campaign, but also taken 39,000 prisoners of war. When Foch looks at the results of Soissons and then looks at the results of the Battle of Amiens, what Ludendorff himself will call the Black Day of the German army, his thinking changes, and it changes on a dime. The Germans themselves realize that they're in deep trouble. In a meeting at the general headquarters at Spa on the 11th of August. Ludendorff and Hindenburg tell the Kaiser the thing that the Kaiser does not want to hear. Germany is no longer capable of offensive operations. From now on, we're going to be on the defense. At the end of this conference, the Kaiser says, we're done. We've got to end the war. And shortly thereafter, he will start issuing out peace feelers to try to get the Allies to negotiate. But by this point, Foch has already realized the tide's turned. There's not going to be a negotiated peace, not the way the Germans anticipated. And Foch himself will sort of say, you know, I've come to the conclusion that maybe, just maybe, we can end this in 1918. We're going to put every effort into it. And you know, hey, look, we really don't have much to lose. Why do you launch all these attacks? Because you can. And the other side can't. As you push forward, even if you don't get victory in 1918, you're going to set the condition to where it's going to be a cakewalk in 1919. And he changes again on a dime. He establishes that American army, and everybody's moving forward with their next plan. In the last 2 weeks of August of 1918, less than a month after he had issued his last planning guidance, he goes back to all his Allied commanders and say, hey, sorry, change of plan. Here's what we're going to do now. Everybody across the whole line is going to attack all at once, and we're not going to stop. We'll keep hitting the Germans, keep hitting the Germans, keep hitting the Germans. The big idea is the Belgians and the British will attack here, pushing down towards the southeast, and I want the Americans and the French to push up this way, catching the German army here in the center, and either they'll be forced to leave or they'll be destroyed. We'll also, as we move forward, cut all of their key logistics infrastructure as we go. Now, the one guy who doesn't like this is John J. Pershing. Since 1917, Pershing had built the idea of the AEF going here in Lorraine, focused on relieving or reducing the Saint-Mihiel salient with a follow-on attack that would then surge the Americans to Metz, and then in 1919 end the war with a drive to the Rhineland. And so he's already given orders by the middle of August 1918 to execute this, and he's moving formations to get ready to do it. When Foch shows up at his headquarters on the 30th of August, Saint-Mihiel attack is supposed to go off in 2 weeks. So on the 30th of August, he shows up at Pershing's headquarters at Chaumont and says, sorry, that ain't going to work for me. A heated argument results, and Pershing himself says, at a point in time in this, I thought about punching Foch in the mouth. It's probably good he didn't, right? And after some cajoling and some work with Pétain, Pershing is brought kicking and screaming. The qualities of Foch's leadership comes out again. He agrees to allow Pershing to attack Saint-Mihiel. Pershing's reality or justification for this is, I need to shake out this new American army before we get committed everywhere else. But the caveat is, this offensive has to be done, and your army has to shift over 60 miles here, reorient in a completely different direction and attack by the 26th of September as part of my plan. In the end, Foch's plan here at the end of August 1918 is the validation of what had happened at Soissons, the turning point of the war, that was then validated by the Battle of Amiens. And ultimately, on the 11th of November 1918, the Germans sue for peace, and the war ends. So, hope that wasn't a shocker. What are your questions? I promise not to use it.
Sean, you described the Americans arriving on this front and working their way into the battles. My question is, do you think that the Allies could have prevailed on this front if the Americans had not been taking part in these campaigns?
I will stick to what I've always said. The Americans win the war just by showing up. That here at the nadir of the entire Allied war effort in 1917, they're the only ray of hope. More importantly, in this key point where the Allies need fresh manpower. No matter how ill-trained they are, the Americans are ready. And so the Americans do a couple of things. I'll go back to the very beginning. My favorite poster. It's in my office. Oh, there we go. This poster comes out in the midst of the German offensives. Here are the Americans. And what you see here is the Kaiser's little weaselly son, the Crown Prince, trying to pry open the Western Front. And in the background is the shadow of the Americans. So here, as the morale of the Allies are being shaken, the argument that comes out is the Americans are not only here, but they're coming in ever larger numbers. And so a long-about way of answering your question, the Americans are key. Even though militarily what they accomplished is not as good as perhaps they could have been if they were better trained, they definitely provided that extra amount in this attritional war that pushed the Allies over the edge. Thank you. Yes, sir.
After 3.5 to close to 4 years of stalemate trench warfare, explain to us the German tactics that enabled them to gain 56 miles in a few days.
Yeah, that's a great question. The Germans recognized pretty early on that they were never going to match the Allies machine gun by machine gun, plane by plane, tank by tank, that they can't do it. So they're trying to figure out ways of negating the Allied material advantages, but still give them some tactical advantage. So one of the things they do is very innovative artillery tactics. There's a German officer named Bruckmüller who is very good at figuring out this new science of artillery. And you got to keep in mind that our conception of artillery starts in World War I. And the idea is not like what you'd seen on the Battle of the Somme, which is 6+ days of constant bombardment. The Germans can't do that. So rather than concentrate their artillery on destroying large swaths of terrain, the Germans under Bruckmüller come up with what is known as the Fuhrwaltz, the fire waltz. I can't destroy everything, but what I can do is use very short, intense barrages on key nodes to paralyze the Allied structure. Okay? So he'll hit command post, because if the command post is shut down, no orders are going out, and confusion will reign. He'll target the enemy's artillery, because the enemy, the Allied artillery is the big hammer that they have. If you can neutralize it, it takes away a lot of the power of the Allied artillery. He'll also have a very innovative use of poison gas. The Germans, of course, are the first ones to use poison gas in 1950, But what they'll do is they'll come up with different gases. They have a sneezing gas, believe it or not. They will drop the sneezing gas on the artillery batteries. The soldiers will start sneezing and snotting up their gas mask, and of course the first thing they do is take off their mask. At that time, they're hit with mustard. So the artillery will paralyze the command structure and the ability to lend artillery, but then they've got something called the storm troops. And the storm troops are infantrymen who are exceedingly well trained. And they're given a lot of very heavy weaponry. And so you are going to tell them, we're not going to do these massive wave attacks. That doesn't work. What we need you guys to do, very well-trained infantry, is move forward, do very good reconnaissance, find the enemy's weak points. Don't go for the strong points. Go around them, come in behind the enemy, destroy their machine guns, break their cohesion, and then drive on and attack the command post and the artillery. It works beautifully. The problem is, how do you get stormtroop units? And this is going to be Germany's dilemma. Yeah, we've got this cool tactical solution to a strategic problem, but to get enough stormtroopers to pull off these big advances, Ludendorff has to basically take all the young ones, all the young, fit, smart soldiers from all the units he can to mass them together. The nature of stormtroop tactics means even though you're avoiding strong points, you're still taking a lot of casualties. And so in Michael Offensive and then Georgette, and then really sort of putting the period on it here at Blucher, all those young ones are dead. They're gone. And who's left in your infantry divisions now? Yeah, old guys like me. who will surrender like this, right? So good question. Did I answer you? Yes, sir.
I don't remember where I read it, but it said something to the effect that the casualties of the U.S. military per time, like how many per month, that this is the greatest number in all of American history.
The Battle of Meuse-Argonne, which starts on the 26th of September and goes until the 11th of November, is the longest, largest, and bloodiest battle in American history. For percentage of the soldiers involved, just to give you an idea, in the first week of the battle, the Americans have just south of 7,000 dead. Now, we have lost 7,000 dead in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan combined in 20 years. So that sort of tells you the intensity. And it continues to grow in the weeks that follow. So this is a massive bloodletting for the Americans. And if you sort of average it out over the other campaigns, in the long run, it's bloodier than Okinawa, it's bloodier than Iwo Jima, it's bloodier than the Battle of the Bulge, which are its sort of closest companions. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the American soldiers are just not well trained for what they're going to do, and their officers aren't much better. The American officers are produced in officer training camps that last 3 months, and the American soldiers call them 90-day wonders. And it's not because these guys are wonderful, it's we wonder how the hell they got a commission. So, and it's not that they're bad guys, it's just like the soldiers themselves are not well trained for one of the biggest and most fundamental changes in warfare in human history. That answer your question? Yeah, excellent. Yes, sir.
How much of a factor was the Spanish flu, and are those numbers included in the casualties? World War I was the last war in which more people died of disease.
Yeah. In fact, had it not been for the Spanish influenza, it would have been the first war in history where more died by combat injuries than that. And of course, Spanish influenza hits in 2 waves, sort of ripped out of the headlines, right? And the first one that hits in the spring of 1918 is relatively mild, but then it hits a real hard virulence in the late summer and fall of 1918. And so thousands of American soldiers are sickened by this, and the Army's own estimate is just south of 30,000 die of influenza. Now, the problem is the Army doesn't even start counting influenza as influenza until October of 1918. And it's generally not the flu that kills the soldiers, it's the pneumonia and the other things that follow it that they kill. So the number is actually probably much higher. And as we've just seen with the Princess liner, as the soldiers are going overseas, you've got large numbers of troops and tight confines that are just the perfect breeding ground for this. And some of the American troop ships landing in the summer and fall of 1918 are plague ships. So many guys are dying on board before they get overseas. It's affecting all the armies. The Germans are hit really hard by this, and it's because the Allied flu blockade is hit. And so they're already malnourished, and so they're susceptible to all the ailments that come with the flu. Yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am.
Can we go back to the Meuse-Argonne for a minute?
Sure.
I have a question, and it's theoretical, but when you look at the history of it, Pershing is continually removing people, removing officers. He's constantly doing this.
Yes.
And there's also this thing going on where the officers are leading from the front. So you're getting this twin effect of junior people being wiped out
Yeah.
and senior people being replaced.
Yes.
How do you think that impacted the amount of time it took for them to clear out Montfaucon and Romagna and all of those sections?
Well, Pershing does not suffer fools lightly. And with a modern war like this, with the sons of the United States at stake, you can understand why they'd do that. But he relieves people for the drop of a hat. That can be good, but what happens then is it creates this sort of climate of fear in the First Army. And that fear permeates all the way down through. There's a place called the Officer Replacement Depot at Blois. Anybody ever heard the term bluey? You went bluey. So if you were sitting there, you went bluey. And at sometimes these junior officers are being replaced just so it looks like their bosses are being proactive in weeding out incompetence. And what happens at the tactical level is sometimes these attacks are pushed much further than they need to be because the officers are afraid of saying, well, we've accomplished all we can do here. Now, when it comes to sort of the Meuse-Argonne campaign, probably the most drastic way that affects is the 35th Division. And in the Kansas-Missouri National Guardsmen, and in the week prior, just days prior to the beginning of the attack, and they're going to lead the attack on the Meuse-Argonne, all of the brigade commanders in the division are relieved of command, along with several of the regimental commanders. And so when these guys are going into battle, really for their first major time, they're being led with guys that they don't know. So that definitely contributed. Yes, sir.
Did the German invention of the Bosch-Haber process for ammonia production allow the Germans to continue the war longer than it otherwise would have?
I'm sorry, say again?
Did the German invention of the Bosch-Haber process for ammonia production extend the German war effort?
Yeah. And this is Fritz Halber. So Germany's got a dilemma. The minute that the Allied blockade begins in 1914, it cuts off the vast majority of German access to phosphates, mostly in the form of bat guano from South America. Now, phosphates are important for two reasons. First of all, they're a key ingredient in fertilizer. The other thing is they're a key ingredient in explosives. So the Germans have very little of this. Now they have to make some ugly calls about where they put their resources. And so Fritz Halber comes into play. And Halber's an interesting character. He is the guy that pushes the Germans to adopt poison gas. So he's really the father of modern gas warfare. He will also get a Nobel Prize for his work in taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere to give both German agriculture and industry the phosphates that they need to continue the war. So without him, the Germans would definitely have been in a much more difficult position. Yeah, very good question. Yes, sir.
It's often been said that the Treaty of Versailles, which I think really was a German surrender, was punished Germany so much that there was the reaction in Germany and kind of paved the way for Hitler and retribution. I don't buy that. I think they got what they deserved. But what is your opinion?
Yeah, yes. Well, I like to put this in perspective. We're often accused, the Allies are often accused of crushing reparations on the Germans. And that was the goal. I mean, if you're the French, after all these losses, you got to think about it. They lost 1.3 million people. And the pre-World War I, France did not reach its pre-World War I level of population until the 1960s. In many ways, a result of this. And so Le Tigre, old Clemenceau, wants some revenge. But what's interesting is the war reparations, if you sort of average out, were actually less than what the Prussians imposed upon the French at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. But it does definitely contribute to discontent. Part of the problem is the Allies do not carry the war into Germany proper. Pershing wants to, and Pershing is probably right, but Foch, whose natural aggressiveness sort of wants to fall it off, is not sure his army could withstand continuing the attack in. What that allows then is for the German army to return to Germany without being defeated on German territory, with their flags flying and their goose-stepping down the street. And so this will ultimately lead to the Doschluss, the stab-in-the-back theory, that Ludendorff will be all part and parcel of. The German army was not defeated, it was stabbed in the back by, fill in the blanks. The November criminals, the liberals, the Bolsheviks, the Jews. And so the Nazis, when they come to power, will help to sort of push that aggrievement up. The war does cost Germany, though. It loses the old state of Poland, which now returns on the map. is carved out of Russian territory, Austrian territory, and German territory. So they are forced to pay, and it definitely leads some irritation. But if you look at what's happening in Weimar, the Germans are actually recovering by the middle of the 1920s when the Great Depression hits. And that's really the thing that sort of hits liberalism in the head, that pushes them really on the path towards extremism. Yeah, a good question. Yeah, and I'm with you, you know. You light a fire standing in a tub of gasoline, don't complain when you get burned, right? Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I realize the technology of war is much different today than what it was back in the period that you were talking about. But nevertheless, are there some overarching lessons that can be learned by us today from these battles that you've described?
Oh, without a doubt. I like to use this analogy with my students. This war fundamentally creates modern conceptions of warfare. If you were to take a British infantry battalion commander from 1815, from the Battle of Waterloo, put him in a time capsule, move him to 1913, yeah, you got to give him a class on switchology, but he understands the battlefield, right? That infantry, cavalry, and artillery still basically works the way that infantry, cavalry, and artillery did fighting Napoleon. But if you were to take a British infantry battalion commander from 1914, put him in a time machine and move him 4 years ahead to 1918, he's lost. The parts don't work the same anymore. And what's interesting is these ideas of combined arms warfare, aviation and artillery and tanks and infantry working together, decentralization of command like the stormtroopers, that's the stuff we still teach in our tactics today. So there is a direct evolution of the stuff we teach at Leavenworth with the conceptions of warfare that come out by the end of 1918. And so when it comes to the larger wars, you know, if you're Germany, you live in a crack house neighborhood, don't start a war, right? But, well, and if you look at the larger sense of World War I itself, it's how easily and effortlessly at times you can slide into wars that really aren't in your interest to do so. And that's a hard thing to do in the moment when passions are flying, to sort of take that step back and go, is this really what we want to do? Yeah, thank you. Good question. Yes, sir.
So towards the end of the war, the Allies had the ability to mechanize a lot more than the Germans had, especially with the tank. Do you believe that had they relied on American industrial production, not without actual military involvement, that they could have mechanized the battlefield and given themselves a technological superiority? It may have taken longer, the war may have lasted longer, but do you believe the Allies could have simply just deployed more tanks and won the war later on in 1919?
Well, that's actually part of where the Allies are thinking. The head of the Royal Tank Regiment, the operations officer for the Royal Tank Regiment, is a guy named J.F.C. Fuller. And he comes out with a plan in the middle of 1918 for winning the war in 1919 that looks exactly like that. Very heavy tank army supported by mechanized infantry, mechanized artillery that would simply overwhelm the Germans. The problem is you are still running out of manpower. That even if you make a tank army, you still have to have the soldiers to put in it. And a British Mark IV tank still has a crew of 8 guys. So there's still a manpower drain even to do that level of mechanization. The bigger problem is while the ideas are there and the technology is there, it still hasn't reached the technological sophistication. I showed you those tanks at the Battle of Amiens, right? Over 500 tanks. Within 3 days of fighting, of those 500 tanks, 38 are left operational. So you would have to have a lot of tanks to continue that on. So the ideas are there that will continue to sort of drive doctrine and development and thought in the 1920s and 30s, but the technology in 1918 hadn't quite caught up with them yet. Very good question, though. Hey, I'm on your dime, so if you guys need to leave, it won't hurt my feelings.
When the Allies finally start moving forward, July, August, have they assimilated the sophisticated German tactics using storm troops and wave attacks and
Well-
flowing around strong points, or are they just fighting the way they had before, but with lots more
See,
tanks and planes?
Here's sort of the irony. Everybody is basically coming to the same conclusions at roughly the same time. Before the Germans even start playing around with their idea of stormtroopers, there's a young French officer named Andrew Lafarge who publishes a manual on his own for basically the tips of how platoon leaders should operate. And many of the things that will become the cornerstone of stormtrooper tactics, Lafarge is already discussing. In fact, the French will lead the way with creating the world's first automatic rifle, the Shosho. And even though it's a technological mess, it is intended to give the lowest levels at the squad and the platoon, along with grenades and the other things, enough firepower to do the same thing the stormtroopers are doing. The only thing it is lacking is really the specialized training that hones them to that fine point. And part of that is the French lose so many guys out of an already small pool that it's hard for them to build up that sophistication. But yeah, very good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I should probably just go home and Google this, but I'm curious. The movie 1917.
Love that movie.
Is that set in history? Is that a real
Yes.
incident?
Yes and no. Okay. 1917 takes place at the beginning of 1917. Okay, and part of this is the realization of the Germans of their situation. We come to see the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun as these really pointless operations. But by the end of those battles, both the British and the French have figured out how to use artillery, that it's now become a hammer. Okay, this grid square offends me, make it go away. The Germans can't respond to that. And their doctrine of, hey, you hold ground at all times is playing into the Allied hands. And so as the battles are going on in the fall of 1916, Ludendorff says, we got to come up with something better. And so what the Germans do is come up with a new defensive doctrine. It's the elastic defense in depth. And what happens there in the movie 1917 is what will be known as Operation Albrecht. So in the winter of 16-17, the Germans will voluntarily pull back from the lines that they had captured, up to 40 kilometers or more, to better defensive terrain. And as they go forward, as they retreat back, and they don't pull back their forces until after they've built concreted in bunkers and all these intricate defenses, always on the reverse slope of a hill, if possible, to negate the effect of Allied artillery. Then they pull back. But as the Germans are pulling back, that whole devastation that you see in the movie, chopping down trees, killing cattle, laying booby traps, are exactly what the Germans are doing. Okay? Now I do wonder why those guys didn't take the bus to the front rather than, putting your hand in a dead guy, but that's just me.
But was there a British offensive that was to go and was called off?
There's little attacks, not that I'm aware of, but there are constant attacks as the British are probing to find out. They wake up one morning, the Germans aren't there, right? And so they're trying to probe forward and figure out where the new German line is. The reality of that is what you see in the Nivelle offensive, right? That one of the reasons that Nivelle fails miserably is the Germans have changed their doctrine. And so when his attack surges forward, there's artillery isn't hitting the same stuff, and the French finally go over the top of Chemin de Dam Ridge, meeting the German elastic defense, and they're cut to pieces. Same thing will happen to the Brits at Passchendaele. The only problem the Germans have there is the water table is so low that they have to build up rather than build down. But they still have a problem. The British have a problem overcoming that elastic defensive depth. But great movie if you hadn't seen it. Anything else? Yes, sir.
In remarks all quiet on the Western Front, he talks about the German guns being so worn that the rounds fell in their own trenches. Is that true?
That's actually true of all the guns of the war. That some of the problems at the Battle of the Somme is that after that constant fighting, that they're also having short rounds. But the Germans, because of their material disadvantage, are definitely experiencing more and more of that as the war goes on. Part of that German development of artillery doctrine is really scientifically fascinating, that they are now taking into account the rotation of the earth and the temperature to try to accurately lay the rounds on target without firing rounds actually at the enemy so they can adjust their fire. That way, when those hurricane bombardments hit, they've got the element of surprise, unlike what happens, for example, at the Battle of the Somme. Okay. Well, thanks for coming out, folks. And I'll be around if you have any other questions. Happy to answer them.
Next month, John King will be speaking on Guadalcanal.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for coming out.